manifestations of Indian culture. And I like this quote because he imagined a different approach to European literature from the perspective of a culture that saw itself in the superior position. Imagine, he's saying, if Europe had been colonized by another power that looked at the products of European culture and who might, such a culture might, I quote, dismiss the Iliad as a crude and empty, semi-savage and primitive epos. Dante's great work as a nightmare of cruel and superstitious religious fantasy. Shakespeare as a drunken barbarian of considerable genius, but with an epileptic imagination. The whole drama of Greece and Spain and England as a mass of bad ethics and violent horrors. And of course, we can see that here Sri Aurobindo is being ironic, but he's making an important point. The point is, we are shaped by the context in which we operate, and we are influenced, whether we recognize it or not, by the norms and ideologies of those contexts. Now, comparative literature as a field of study is currently undergoing a sort of revival, and I'm going to argue that this is due to the rising importance of translation. Aha, I see the tea has arrived. I may take a tea break myself at a certain point, with your permission. Back in 2012, Gayatri Spivak wrote a polemical book. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, Death of a Discipline, that actually called for a new approach to comparative literature book. And Spivak's book was one of a long line of negative polemics about comparative literature. The famous essay by René Wellick in 1959, The Crisis of Comparative Literature. René Etiamble, the French scholar, in 1967 wrote, Comparaison n'est pas raison. Comparison is not reason. And accusations against comparative literature have involved being too Eurocentric, marginalizing minority languages and literatures, failing to distinguish itself from world literature. But in 2017, the American Comparative Literature Association produced a report entitled simply The State of the Discipline. And in her introduction, Ursula Heist argued that there have been positive developments in the 21st century in comparative literature. These include continued interest in literary theory, post-colonial theory, world literature, with its emphasis, and this is important about world literature, the emphasis on the agencies involved in the cross-cultural migration of texts. And I would add a fourth, and probably the most important, translation. Translation and the study of translation has become, I think, a vital element in literary studies. And I would suggest that it is reinvigorating comparative literature, the study of comparative literature. Now, translation studies is a relatively recent field. It began in the 1970s, and I can say this with absolute confidence because the little group of international scholars who met in Belgium and the Netherlands in the 1970s, I was one of them. And the term translation studies was invented by one of the founders, the American poet and translator. Important to remember that of that little group that met, we were all not just talking about translation, we were doing translations. We were translating. And I would argue that the connection, there needs to be a connection when we talk about translation between the actual act of translating. Through the practice, one understands so much more than looking at it in the abstract. The aim of translation studies, very clear aims, to raise the profile and status of translation through the systematic study of how, when, and where translations take place. We all know that translation involves the transfer of something from one language to another, but the moment we start to look more closely at that process, we can see that something more than the linguistic is involved. For example, as we know only too well, not all languages claim the same power and status. Literary and cultural history show us this. We look at the dominance of English in the world today and consider the gap between translations into English and out of English. Michael Cronin, one of the leading scholars of translation today, and a very good translator, he wrote a book on translation in Ireland in 1996, and has this to say: if political relationships in Europe have been characterized over the centuries by asymmetry, languages have been both accomplices and victims. Translation relationships between minority and majority languages are rarely ever divorced from issues of power and identity. And this, of course, is something that translation studies has brought about. We think more today about the, let's say, not just the inequality of power relationships between languages, but we think much more in terms of the whole ideological framework behind translations. It's also important to remember that translators are not creatures from another planet. They are individuals with their own opinions, and every translation is effectively one reader's, one translator's interpretation of a text. James Holmes said, he used the adjective perverse. It's perverse, said James, to even think that you could have exact equivalence between languages. And he also pointed out that if you give us the same text to a group of different translators, they'll all produce slightly different versions. And yet, a great many people have only minimal understanding of the complexities of translation. And all too often, those who do have some acquaintance with other languages have what I call an ambiguous attitude to the translation of literature, which is, of course, reflected in a discourse, a continued discourse of negativity. Uncertainty about how to assess the quality of a translation leads to some people saying, well, a translation should perfectly reproduce an original. Failure to do this would be seen as unfaithfulness or betrayal. But as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, perfect reproduction is a myth. And so one of the very first tasks of translation studies as it began to develop through the 1980s was to attack the notion that there could ever be exact equivalence between linguistic systems, let alone between linguistic and cultural systems. There is not, there never can be, a perfect definitive translation, not only because of the variations between translators, but because the criteria for perfection, the aesthetic criteria that prevail at different points in time, are endlessly variable, constantly changing. And we can see this in the way in which some texts, I've been asked to write an essay on retranslations. And this is a very interesting area because as you find that retranslations show up very clearly the point I'm trying to make, that aesthetic criteria differ. Aesthetic and ideological criteria differ enormously over time. I think one of the best examples that I give my students is Dr. Johnson, who declared that Pope's Homer was absolutely unrivaled, it was absolutely magnificent, and yet 50 years later, it was being dismissed as belonging to a, because of course it was done in heroic couplets. And the moment the vogue for heroic couplets disappeared, nobody wanted to read anything written in heroic couplets, and it was judged a very long way away from Dr. Johnson's point about its perfection. And the other thing that translation studies has given us is the need to think that there are other agents besides the translator involved in the production and dissemination of translation. Publishing houses, funding bodies, advertisers, in earlier times, patrons of the arts, not to mention censors, who would vet translations to ensure that nothing untoward the wrong kind of material was not being imported. I mean, early translations of the novels of Émile Zola, for example, were heavily censored to take out passages that were deemed immoral for Victorian readers. One of my students, my former PhD students, who's now a distinguished professor in his own right, Professor Christopher Rundle, he has become an expert on the history of translation. And in particular, he did his PhD with me on the difference in terms of censorship between dubbing and subtitling, a field that had received only minimal attention. But actually, one of the things I pointed out to him was that I said, somebody needs to do some research on, let's look at Europe. Where did the dubbing industry in film develop? And the answer, when you start to look, is it developed under totalitarian regimes in fascist Italy, in Nazi Germany, in Spain under Franco. And why? Well, the answer again is perfectly simple, because if you dub something, then none of the viewers have any access to the source text. Whereas if you have subtitles, you can read the subtitle, and if you have two languages, you can actually see or hear what's going on. So there's an ideological component to dubbing and subtitling, which has everything to do with censorship at certain moments in time. And of course, one basic issue for readers of translation is that we have to take translations on trust. Trust, I think, is a very important word here, because if we want to read something written in a language that we don't know, the only thing we can do is to read a translation. And I think it's no wonder that over time, over the centuries, translators have been criticized, sometimes attacked as untrustworthy. Sometimes translators have been censored and generally persecuted. The history of Bible translation, for example, is a history full of horror stories. Jan Hus and William Tyndale burned at the stake. The translator, the Japanese translator, I mean, it's not just in earlier times. We can find examples in 1991, the Japanese translator of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses was murdered. When I say we, I'm talking about people in general. We are uncomfortable about translation because it requires trust. And to what extent are we willing to trust? Think of the role of translators in war zones, for example, and think of the situation with people in fraud, because I'm including interpreters when I talk about translators here. The need to trust a translator is essential, and yet at the same time, it relies on us handing over, in a sense, to the translator and believing in the translator. And that's something that many people are unwilling to do. I'm always being asked, for example, by people who have nothing to do with translation. One of my neighbors asked me not long ago, I've just read this terrific book. It's by the woman Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But how do I know that I'm reading what she wrote? To which I could only say, well, you don't. You've just got to trust this. You've just got to trust the translator. She won the Nobel Prize. Indeed, all Nobel Prize winners win because their works are translated into a whole range of languages. But I thought it was an interesting question from someone not involved in translation. How do I know I'm reading the same text? Well, of course, in many ways, you're not. You're reading a version, an interpretation. Now, as the new field of translation studies began to grow, it followed a pattern that I think in academic life we've become familiar with. As happened with other subjects emerging in the late 70s and 1980s, such as post-colonial studies, women and gender studies, cultural studies, One important line of research was the historical. The feminist slogan of the day, hidden from history, was actually important and can be equally applied to translation. Michael Cronin's Translating Ireland, I've already mentioned. We can think of Lawrence Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility, a history of translation, where Venuti claimed, I think quite rightly, that translators had so often been ignored that they virtually, although their contribution was enormous, they'd been more or less written out. We don't know their names in most cases. Research into the history of translations is still important. I think it's still an important area for scholars and for PhD students, because it can change our ideas about, basically, change our ideas in relation to national literary histories. How many literatures have evolved in isolation is the question to ask. An enormous number. I mean, English literature, let's think of English literature, which was so hugely reliant on translations for centuries, not only in the early to late Middle Ages, but through the Renaissance, the 17th century, the 18th century. And when we're thinking about translation, we might also want to think that although English has been exporting its literature for some time now, there are enormous numbers of texts that are imported into English, texts that I suppose we would call popular literature. We might want to think of detective fiction. In the last few years, the rise of Scandinavian, Nordic noir, Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, Norwegian, Finnish fiction, selling in tens of millions of copies. Jo Nesbø, the Norwegian thriller writer, I think has sales of over 60 million copies. So that translation is actually going on various levels, not only on terms of Nobel Prize winners, but also in terms of what André Lefebvre and I have called the non-academic reader, the non-professional reader. Everyone in this room can be claimed to be a professional reader, but there are lots and lots of non-professional readers too. But back to the question of translation history. A logical next stage in the development of translation studies was to focus on the figure of the translator. Who are these translators? Who are they? What do we know about them? Do we know anything? The visibility of translators was very much discussed through the 1990s, as of course were issues in relation to translation. We've already heard Umberto Eco quoted this morning by our chair, and we might think of Cronin's book on translation and identity, translation in the digital age, eco-translation, which took translation, the study and thinking about translation, a stage further. Cronin points out in eco-translation that he's referring to some of the vast planetary changes in communication over the last few years. And he has this to say: the digital may deliver information to the other side of the planet in seconds, but if the language is different, the virtual letters are dead letters. In a multilingual world, translation is the necessary companion of the global outreach of the virtual. And what the cases that Cronin is talking about is, of course, international relief agencies. And he was particularly affected by what happened during the great earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, when the actual rescue operation was hampered by the absence of translators. Translation has this enormously important role. But let me just take you back again to the 1970s, to the beginnings of translation studies, when translation studies was beginning. What was it? It was a little movement. It was challenging orthodox thinking in linguistics and literary studies. It was demanding a space for the study of translation. It was demanding a change in the status of translation and translators, because another thing that was pointed out, and we've talked about a lot, translators often very poorly paid. So in terms of improving the status of translators, if you pay translators little, it's unlikely that you're going to get very good translations. We wanted also to get more recognition of the role played by translation in cultural development, notably in literary history, rethinking national discourses and thinking about the role of translation. We also wanted to move beyond the emphasis on the European, because it was pointed out the invisibility, I'm using Venuti's terminology of invisibility, the invisibility of much writing from outside the Euro-American mainstream. And this is something that many African scholars, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example, took up with great success and we can see, if you look back through the whole history of the development of post-colonial studies, you will see, I'm sure you all know, many of you will know far better than I do, the importance here of rethinking the Anglo-American dominance in literary studies. But translation studies really began to grow in the 1990s. And I can again say this with confidence because I published my little book, Translation Studies, in 1980. And it was part of the series of books, the New Accent series that Terence Hawkes edited, that was trying to introduce new thinking about literary and cultural studies. And that book was reprinted in 1991. It didn't do very well in the 1980s. Not many people bought it. Unbelievably, it's gone through 4 editions. There will be a 5th edition coming shortly. And the book is more successful now than it was back in 1980, which I still find incredible. It is, if you like, first-hand evidence that translation studies and thinking about translation has gained in importance. Through the 1990s, over the last 30 years, we've seen publications, we've seen conferences, we've seen journals, we've seen events like this, we've seen publications like Ideas. And I think, you know, it's interesting to think, why should this have happened? It certainly hasn't just happened because a small group of scholars got together and said we need to talk about translation. Something else has happened. And I have said in various essays that I've written, big political changes have epistemological consequences. We can see this happening in so many times if we look at the history of literature. The collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe led to the rise of vernacular languages and literatures. The Renaissance was an age that discovered ancient learning through translations. The Reformation, which divided Catholic and Protestant, was all about translation. The invention of printing in the West revolutionized the dissemination of information. The ideas that underpinned revolutions through the 19th century transformed the way in which the relationship between human beings and the divine and human beings and nature were seen. Romanticism was an artistic translation of political revolutionary ideas. We could go on and on. The Cultural Revolution in China, China opening up to the West, and so on. But in the 1990s, there were major planetary changes that took place. One of these, obviously, was the end of the Soviet Union, the China opening up to the West, the end of apartheid in South Africa, technologically, the arrival of the World Wide Web. One of the immediate effects of all of these changes was that millions more people began to travel. They traveled because in a sense, they could travel. It became possible to travel, but they also, that is, they had passports for the first time. There was a developing tourist industry, a huge tourist industry that began to grow, cheap flights. Suddenly, millions more people were in movement. And millions more people were not only in movement because of these changes that I've mentioned, but also millions more people began to move as a result of natural disasters, war, famine, persecution. So that today we have a completely different world than certainly when I was a student and when my academic career started. An enormously different world with different values, people moving in very different ways. And I think that all of this has raised awareness of translation understood in its broadest sense, not just as interlingual transfer, but also as intercultural transfer. And I think this is partly why in the 1990s we began to see these changes. André Lefebvre and I published a book in 1990, a collection of essays based on a conference like this that we organized, and it's entitled Translation, History and Culture. And we pointed out that one of our statements, translation basically is a form of rewriting, and translations, like all rewritings, are never innocent. There's always a context in which a translation takes place. There's always a history from which a text emerges. And there's always a context and a history into which a text is transposed. Translation, we said, involves so much more than the simple engagement of an individual with a bilingual dictionary. Indeed, the bilingual dictionary is itself an object lesson in the inadequacy of any concept of equivalence as linguistic sameness. How many readers, and I ask my students this all the time, are constantly frustrated as they endeavor to look up a word or a phrase in a bilingual dictionary, only to discover that the range of terms offered gives them a series of choices that they are ill-equipped to undertake. And if you want a good example of this, I suggest that you take a look at some of the translations that are on offer in the tourist industry, in hotels, in restaurants. Menus is one of the most wonderful examples for students of inadequate translations where someone has looked something up in a bilingual dictionary and completely failed to choose the right term. What we were trying to say with that book and that conference is that different cultures are not simply groups of people who label the world different. Languages give us the possibility to shape our own views of the world, and languages are different from one another. We express what we see and feel through language, but because languages are so clearly culture related, we often find that what we say in one language cannot be expressed in another. And this was my starting point when I referred back to my early childhood. This was something that before I could articulate what it was, I could actually see that there were these differences. The English word, good example I use with my students, is the English word homesickness. If we translate that into Italian, it's translated as nostalgia. But then English has borrowed nostalgia, which in English then becomes nostalgia, pronounced differently but spelled in the same way, which isn't quite homesickness. It's a kind of longing. Homesickness and longing put together are almost, but not quite, the Portuguese saudade, which is an untranslatable term that describes a state of mind that's not really despair, but it's a state of mind. Angst, which is borrowed from German, is sort of sadness or regret, but it hovers somewhere between. We could go on and on with these. I mean, I owe thanks to the Czech novelist Milan Kundera for picking up on a number of these and pointing out that these are terms explaining emotional states of mind, which aren't strictly translatable. The early Bible translators, those of you who know the work of Eugene Nida, will know that the early Bible translators hit the whole problem of untranslatability and negotiation head on. How, Nida asked at one point, do you translate the image of the Lamb of God for a culture in which sheep don't exist? What exactly was the fruit that Eve is supposed to have picked in the Garden of Eden? What was the creature that swallowed Jonah? He was supposedly swallowed by a whale, but there aren't any whales in the Mediterranean in warm southern seas, and so on and so on. Faced with all these unsurmountable linguistic problems, what translators have done is to negotiate the boundaries and compromise. And I think the word compromise is important. Speakers of more than one language know this. You know that we are constantly having to compromise when we deal with the unfamiliar. The word democracy means different things in different countries. It's the same word, but it means different things. A word like bread has completely different social significance and appears physically different in different cultures, and yet it's a translatable term. When Gabriel Garcia Marquez was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, he started out with a story about Antonio Pigafetta, the Florentine navigator, who in his diary recorded all the marvelous creatures that he'd seen. But he had no words. He wrote, for example, he'd seen a monstrous creature with the head and ears of a mule, the body of a camel, the hooves of a deer, and the neigh of a horse. What was it? It was a llama. And the word llama had to be taken from the Peruvian language Quechua, because there was no word to describe this extraordinary animal. Now, I'm going to take now about another, I reckon I can do about another, if you're all up for it, I can do another roughly 10 to 15 minutes and then take some questions. Yes? Can I do that?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
All right, good. I just wanted to be absolutely certain that I can just have this little bit longer so I can finish. Right. What I think became important in translation studies then, and the pathways that needed to be followed, were to continue researching into ways in which translation has developed in different cultural contexts. What's the history of translation in different contexts? For example, I don't know, I've never had access to it, been able to read the history of translation in Bangladesh, and I think this would be a really interesting area. There may be PhD students already working on this, but I think the history of translation in different contexts is one important area. It's important also to move away from the Eurocentric models. I mean, I work in a range of languages, but all my languages are, I'm sorry to say, are European languages, ancient and modern. I don't have a non-European language. I think it's important also to look at what I'm calling the intertraffic between cultures in terms of translation. What gets translated? Why? Why are, as Ibn Zohar said all those years ago, why are there times of immense translation activity and other times when there's very little translated? What is imported? What's exported? In the early 19th century, for example, we can see right across Europe in Italian, Hungarian, Russian, German, the poetry of Lord Byron was extensively translated. Byron was seen then as a revolutionary poet. His work strongly affected the Russian poet Pushkin, the Czech poet Macha, and we can see that Byron had a major impact on the literatures in both those languages. Even today, when I have seminar groups with students from Greece or from Germany or from Italy, and I ask if anyone has read Byron, they virtually all read at least something of Byron. But if I ask the same of most English literature students within Britain, nobody's read any Byron at all. Byron has sort of sunk out of fashion and is no longer taught. These kinds of patterns, these movements are very interesting. And of course, I'm sure you all know that Shakespeare was regarded as a revolutionary playwright right across Europe, largely due to the translation of his history plays and of plays like Macbeth and Lear, which looked at issues of power. In other cases, we might point out that although in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the three greatest Italian medieval writers, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio were translated. Indeed, Petrarch's sonnets transformed poetry in English. Dante had to wait until the 19th century. It's also the case when we think about translation that the status of texts that initially shock or surprise can be transformed. I would see this as a form of translation. When Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels came out in 1726, it was a savage satire of human expectations. Robinson Crusoe, another important sociological text, but then both of those today are regarded as children's literature. There has been a shift in how the texts are translated by cultural readers. I think we can summarize all of this by just saying that translation studies over the years has come to recognize the growing awareness of the complexity of translation. There has been some very significant thinking about this. The American comparative literature scholar Bela Brodsky made some important points and argues that translation today needs to be understood as a politics as well as a poetics, an ethics as well as an aesthetics. I think that's an important quote. Translation is also broadening out at the moment. It is, we're used to be thinking of translation as an empirical linguistic maneuver, but actually translation involves, as I've been trying to argue, very much more. And yet, in 2019, Lawrence Venuti, one of the most significant translation scholars today, Lawrence Venuti published a polemic. He called it Contra-Instrumentalism, subtitled A Translation Polemic. And his view is that despite all the advances of translation studies, all the rethinking of the importance of translation, there are still some problems. What are the problems? Well, says Venuti, I mean, he tells us, he has in his polemic, he says, stop doing this. And he writes in capital letters, stop, S-T-O-P. So stop using terms like faithful and unfaithful, and recognize that equivalence between translation and origin is variable. Stop assuming that translation is substitution. Recognize it as a highly sophisticated mode of interpretation. Stop evaluating translations by comparing them to the source, because there's something different. Stop asserting that some texts are untranslatable. Every text is translatable because every text can be interpreted. And stop treating translation as a metaphor. Recognize that translation is a material practice that is both linguistic and cultural. And what he's saying here, and I think, I remember he came to Glasgow and tried this out on my students and everyone got very excited about it. And he was saying, stop. And because basically what I think Larry Venuti is saying is that translation involves both the micro and the macro, both close reading and distant reading. And we cannot really separate these. Now, I'm going to pretty well conclude. I I've been working lately on translating across time. I'm particularly interested in why there are certain texts that seem to continue to be translated across time. I'm fascinated by the emergence of a new field over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years called classical reception studies, in which scholar translators look back at some of the ancient foundation texts and reinterpret them because, and this is an important point in the European context, and particularly in the Anglophone context, whereas my generation still studied Latin and Greek, these are languages that have virtually disappeared. And so the whole question of who reads Homer and who can read Virgil and Catullus and the ancient Romans is now an interesting point. They can only read through translations. So no translation, my basic message, no translation can ever be the same as its source text. But rather than seeing this as something that's lost, we need to see it as part of a process, part of an organic process. Once a translation enters the receiving culture, it sets off on a new path. Thinking back to the classics, Homer, the Iliad, began probably as an oral poem, but over the ages has become a source for writers, painters, creative artists across the world, and has moved to new life in new languages and new forms. But one of the things that I've been writing about is that some of the most recent translations focus on what the Iliad actually is about, which is the horrors of war. And rather than it being a poem, as previous generations saw it, as something that focused on the anger of Achilles and the relationship between Achilles and Hector, some of the newer translations and versions are looking at the horrors of war, because in the 21st century, one of the things that most appalls us, all of us, whether every time we switch on our televisions or hear anything, are the monstrous horrors of war. All texts, my final message then, all texts are available to us, but they all come through some sort of mediation. Jacques Derrida called this an inscription. The text has always been placed in some network of signification. And as I said right at the start, we all have our own individual, different mental encyclopedia. Our mental encyclopedia, as I said at the start, is something that we have constructed individually for ourselves, but it comes out of the context in which we operate. And I think I'm going to stop there. I hope what I've said has interested some of you, and I'm very happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions or comments or disagreements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. So I'm sure the audience have a lot of questions, and it's a shame that we could not have you here on the stage. Like, it would have been really wonderful, right? So you could have crossed the ocean and come here, and reach our young audience right here. Okay, so I think I will begin with a question that I have, like, when you were talking about compromises that we make when we do translation, but how about the machine translation, so especially in this AI invaded or invested cultural milieu. So how do you negotiate the intervention of AI and machine translation?
This is something, honestly, I'm going to have to answer by saying I simply don't know. It's a scary prospect. It's we already have begun to, I think some of the polemics that I'm starting to see around this are suggesting that AI is going to have a much bigger impact, not so much on literary texts, but certainly in things like the tourist industry and so on. I mean, I some of you may know I write a regular column a few times, 6 times a year for a bi-monthly periodical called the ITI Bulletin, which is the Bulletin for Translators and Interpreters. And one of the things I wrote about was, this might sound facetious, but I don't think it is. I wrote about getting a new car and with a sat nav that spoke to me. And it said very strange things in English. Every time it gave me a direction, it said, please, take the next left, please. And I thought, this is an extraordinarily polite sat nav. Why is it doing this? Until a friend from Germany came to visit and said, oh, you've got a new car. And I said, yes. I said, it's an old Volkswagen and so on. And he just burst out laughing. And he said, Susan, this is basically an AI or a computer generated. It's a translation, but it's from the German. And of course, in German, we would say bitte all the time. So it's it's not wrong. It's just culturally different. And I had been driving along thinking, why is it so polite? I've never heard a guidance that does. And I think these are the kind of little hiccups between languages and cultures. And I think, I mean, one of the concerns I'm sure that we all have at the moment in the world is the controls over social media and the absence of controls over social media and the power of social media. And if we add AI into that mix, it is, something that I think is going to need a lot of thinking by a lot of people with more expertise and more power than I have. And I'm sorry if that's an inadequate response, but I just don't know.
It makes sense. But one of the students has a similar question. So Sohan Sharif, and he's asking regarding ChatGPT and Copilot, that you mentioned translation as interpretation.
Mm.
So how do you think, who is interpreting, if it is ChatGPT or Copilot?
Absolutely. Who is interpreting? We've just had obviously we've just had the American elections, and I have read a lot and watched a lot, and here everything depends entirely on what appears. I think this is one of the issues for many years. Whenever I had a seminar of undergraduates, I would always get them to read one of this is before the advent of social media. I would always get them to read one of the English newspapers, particularly like The Sun, a very right-wing newspaper, hugely popular, selling in large quantities. My students would always start out by saying, we don't want to read this. Goodness, we don't want to read it. And I would say, yeah, but I want you to read it. And then I would ask, do you ever read it? Well, sometimes if I find it on a bus or whatever. And then I would show them taking it apart bit by bit. This was a newspaper that you could read from the front. It always had a sensational headline, but you could read it from the back where the sports pages were. And most people would read the sport and then read backwards. Now, the way in which the layout, the physical layout, the use of black on white, the use of photographs, the kinds of stories, all of this was very, very sophisticated. And yet my students, who were all self-styled intellectuals, were being manipulated without actually realizing. And I think that this is why, if I were devising a new degree program for anyone, I would want to have something called critical thinking and how to read embedded in that. How to read. How do we deal with ChatGPT? How do we deal? I think the need to understand, and this is where I talked before about the micro and the macro. I think we need to be able to really dig down and see in micro terms what's going on, because that will then shed light on the broader picture.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? I think I will ask another one. For those of us who translate here, it's almost a thankless job, and you're always guilty that you have failed to deliver as a translator. And if a writer does not get any literary award, it's the translator's fault. Would you agree?
Well, the translator, of course, has a responsibility. I mean, I've just done a small translation myself. 3 weeks ago, I translated a short one-act play by a distinguished Spanish writer. I can't say who it is because it hasn't yet come out, and it's coming out in something which is a festschrift for a colleague, and so at the moment it's secret. And on the one hand, it was perfectly straightforward to translate, but then it wasn't. And the problem involved the actual terminology of theatre. It involved the stage directions, not what people were saying. The dialogue was fine. It was the stage directions. And I began to realize here that, of course, this was one of the classic examples, like the ones I've just given, that things could be said in Spanish that you couldn't say in English. And so I have compromised, and I don't know whether or not it could well be that someone will look at that and say, gosh, what was that woman doing? She got it wrong. I think there's always with translations, why I say we have to compromise, and it's in compromising sometimes that we make mistakes, but sometimes we make great discoveries. But I think, we're all doomed as translators always to, and I mean, this is the case of anything one writes, it's the case of, I have some friends who are very well-known poets who say, oh, I should never have allowed that poem to be published because I could have changed. I could have, we always want to, there's that lovely English word to tweak. We always want to tweak a translation, tweak a poem, tweak something to make it better.
Great. So I have another question from the audience. So is translation a business? Should we consider it as an enterprise?
Well, in some cases it is. In some cases it is an enterprise. It's big business. I mean, this is why the sort of things I'm talking about when I'm talking about literature, this is a very small part of translation overall. Translation, if you look, there are big translation agencies, there are huge commercial translations. There's a need, a constant need. I mean, one of the things that is when in the European Parliament, for example, there's an enormous need to have teams of translators and interpreters working, and that's a business. And people have to be trained. If you're doing legal translation or commercial translation or diplomatic interpreting, anything like that, there's a huge need there for translating and seeing it as a business. In literary terms, when we're thinking about literature, there's two things going on. I mentioned earlier detective fiction, and obviously this detective fiction and some of the big look at the translation of the Harry Potter novels. That has become a global business. However, there's also been a rise in the last few years of small publishers who have a different attitude. And I can say this because I'm one of the judges of the Women Writers in Translation Prize. And what we've seen with this prize is that we're about to announce our winner in 1 week's time, a week tomorrow, the winner will be announced. But the number, when you look at, we look not only at what is the book, who's translated, we also look at the publisher. And we've seen a steady rise in the number of publishers small publishers, not just the big well-known ones, but small publishers, some of them founded specifically to deal with translations. So I think yeah, translation is a business, but there are many, many strands in that business, from the huge commercial to the, let's say, the legal, the technological, right down to the literary and the small publishers.
Great. So I think we have another question. So he's going to ask it himself. Right? Go ahead. Sure.
Hello, ma'am. Good afternoon. It was a fascinating session with you, fascinating session. And as you have mentioned about subtitles and dubbing in our movies, as the streaming platforms are rising, so I see subtitles and dubbing are not only just an assist to learn another language, but also an exposure to different cultures. So what can creating subtitles, what are the areas where creating subtitles can be developed to achieve cultural accuracy? Just one or two tips. What should we keep in mind when we create subtitles? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question, but it would take me another hour or so to answer it. I think yeah, in those countries, again, my examples are all European. In the Netherlands, in Denmark, Sweden, and so on, where subtitling is the norm, not dubbing, this has helped language learning enormously. The educators widely recognize this, that I personally, I like subtitled films in those languages that I know, because I can do a sort of translation, I can do a double thing. However, it is the case that subtitling is, as I say, subtitling is a complex activity. Again, we were talking just a minute ago about business. There's an entire business here. I think what is important for me, what I see missed in some cases, is what I'm going back to Hallidayan linguistics, the register. And I can give you a good example of this. There's a very popular Italian detective series of books called Inspector Montalbano. Inspector Montalbano has been huge in Italy for years. The author wrote a series of short books, of Camilleri, and he's now died, and he was from Sicily. And so one of the things that you have in these books is, because Sicily is a separate area with a very, very strong, you could almost say that Sicilian is almost like a separate language. You have Italian, then you have very, very strong Sicilian dialect, which I can't understand, and an Italian from Rome or Florence couldn't understand. And then you have something in between, which is a regional variant. Now, the books rely on interplay between these, because there are ideological interpretations here. Our inspector can do two things. He speaks in Sicilian, not so much dialect, but he uses the accent. But every so often, when he wants to be very proper and speak to his superior, he goes into standard Italian. And when he's dealing with the peasant farmers or fishermen, he goes into dialect. None of that comes across in English. It doesn't come across in the written translation of the books, and it certainly doesn't come across in the dubbing. And I think, for me, this is a huge loss, because actually part of Camilleri's politics, if you like, is to talk about these social inequalities that are manifest in language. How do you do that? And it's a problem. And of course, it's a particular problem if you're coming into English, because, I mean, I had this years ago when I was translating a Mexican novel, and my publisher said he wanted me to translate it into transatlantic English. And my point was, I can't do that. And I can see now when I read some of the translations submitted for the Women's Prize, I can see immediately which ones have been done by Americans and which have been done by British, because the language is different. So if you're dubbing something or subtitling something for an Anglophone public, oh my goodness, there's a problem. That's not a proper answer to your question, but I'm just giving you that as an example.
But I also get the gist of it, that you have to go to the native, actually, and you have to, if you are a translator or you are creating subtitles, then you have to go to a native for that. That, I think that's the first priority, and translator should do.
Translators have, first of all, to be excellent readers. This is what I'm saying about the micro and the macro. You have to really, really understand and read what it is that you're translating. And only then will you have a proper grasp of what you need to do.
Ma'am, that was so insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Great. So you had a list of stops, and I think all good things must come to a stop. So with that, we'll come to a stop. But before we go, like, just going back to the last idea that you mentioned. So on Netflix, you get to see that the new European films, they're both dubbed and subtitled. And when you listen to the, the dubbing, so they're done by native speakers.
Yep.
And the subtitles are always very literary,
Yes.
or so almost like machine translated, so
Yep.
you can see the difference. So I totally see what you were saying. So thank you so much. So it has been an enlightening session, and I'm sure all my audience here, they would agree to this. So can we have a round of applause for our speaker? All right. So really appreciate your time, and I'm sure Dr. Mahbub will be in touch, and we hope to see you in person, down the road.
That would be lovely. And thank you for your chairing, and thank you for being a lovely audience. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you so much. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Sure.